Good morning. Thank you all for coming, and thank you very much indeed for inviting me. This will be a fairly brief overview of 700 years of patronage. I will start off by giving a background to who the samurai were and how the crafts and arts were patronized by them and indeed encouraged from the 12th century right through to the 19th century. The image we see here is a posthumous portrait of the Shōgun Tokugawa Ieyasu in court robes. Early Japanese emperors were polygamous, which gave rise to complicated questions of succession. And during the Heian period, 794 to 1185, lesser members of the imperial family had their titles removed and were sent off to the provinces to rule in the name of the emperor. Over time, a clearly defined military class developed in the provinces with their allegiance to local family groupings rather to the court in Kyoto. And it's from these allegiances to the regional lords that the samurai, literally one who serves, began to emerge as a distinct class. We see here a detail of a screen in the Viennese collection showing the famous fording of the Uji River at the height of the civil wars in 1184. It's historically accurate in the depiction of the armour, apart from the helmet, which is actually a 15th century helmet. But as the painting's 17th century, we won't argue too much about that. But it is a superb piece, superb craftsmanship on the helmet, the fittings of the armour, and of the sword itself, and we'll come back to the sword later on in my talk. In a nationwide conflict from 1180 to 1185, the Minamoto clan inflicted a crushing defeat on the Taira clan, and in 1185, Minamoto Yoritomo established his military government at Kamakura. In 1192, he was appointed Shōgun, great barbarian conquering generalissimo, by the emperor, thereby beginning nearly 700 years of military rule of Japan. Ruling, of course, in the name of the emperor at the whole time, but effectively controlling the emperor for most of this period as well, I have to add. The samurai elite became patrons of the craft workers and developed their own military aristocracy. They were expected not only to master the arts of war, but also literary and administrative skills. Many were well versed in poetry and were patrons of painters and sculptors and attended literary salons held by the imperial court nobles. Japan was not unified at this time. There was still insurrection throughout Japan, but the shogunate based in Kamakura, some distance from Kyoto, did its best to keep Japan under control. But there were still many regional warlords struggling against the Minamoto clan. But it's interesting to see here the difference between the mounted warrior of the 12th century and the warrior in court robes. These are exactly the same sort of robes that would be worn at the imperial court, but of course his sword is always with him. This is a sword style called kenukigata that was worn with robes such as this. It wasn't until Tokugawa Ieyasu's final victory in 1615 against his opponents that Japan was at last truly unified and under the control of a powerful shogun. Ieyasu was appointed as shogun in 1603. The date 1605 for the beginning of the Tokugawa shogunate is given because that's when his final opponents were defeated at the Battle of Osaka Castle. The Tokugawa family, like previous military rulers, developed their own military aristocracy centered on the shogun's court in Edo, modern-day Tokyo. We have a detail here of Edo Castle. The remnants of Edo Castle can be found in today's Imperial Palace in Tokyo. A huge city rapidly developed around the castle, and with around 1 million people, Edo was one of the largest cities in the world. Castle towns all over Japan became production centers for master craftsmen who were attracted there under the patronage of the samurai elite. In particular, those who were involved in crafts relating to arms and armour, but also painters who would decorate the lavish interiors of the samurai residences. Arms and armour was still extremely important to the samurai. It was a symbol of their authority Armour and swords represented power. And we see here on the left a swordsmith producing a sword in his smithy adorned with Shinto gohei, so that prior to the production of the sword, the smith would abstain from alcohol, would abstain from sex, and would purify his smithy, often invoking the name of the gods in the production of the sword. And on the right, a detail from the image on the left is from a book called Saiga Shokunin Burui, a handbook of craftsmen. And on the right, it's an anonymous screen called Shokunin Zakushie. Shokunin means craftsman. And we see here the production of armour, many different forms of armour. There's the wonderful braiding being produced here. There's the lacquering of the sleeves here. There's the lacquering of a face mask here. And in case you ask what this basket is doing up there, it's a very curious device, worn on the back of armour when galloping, and it's covered with silk, and it's said to bounce arrows off if it hits it. I would have thought it would have acted rather as a windsock while galloping along, but there we are. So all of these things were being produced in the castle towns for the samurai who still required arms and armour. And it was the top quality craftsmen who came to the castle towns, and they had a ready market there. The Tokugawa shogunate introduced a system of alternate attendants, sankin kotai, whereby the regional daimyo, the warlords, appointed by the Tokugawa shogunate, after the battles of the early 1600s, they appointed their own people or people who had supported them to rule on their behalf in the provinces. The regional daimyo not only had to maintain their provincial domains, but they also had to maintain a presence at the shogun's court in Edo, where in fact often their family were held as hostages, effectively. In fact, Tokugawa Ieyasu himself as a child had been a hostage. While out in the provinces, they ruled on behalf of the shogunate, but on the parades back to Edo, which they had to do once a year, this was a time when they could show off their wealth and their taste. And the size and splendour of the daimyo's cortege were recognised as an indication of his status, and they were impressive affairs. And they were attired with fine armour and fine swords. And much of the armour produced during the Edo period was purely for sankin kotai or for other purposes. I'm showing you this armour here, which was a garniture made for the daimyo Abe Masayoshi. From 1715, he was daimyo of Bungo province. This is now in the Crow Museum of Asian Art at the University of Texas in Dallas. I had the great pleasure of spending 3 days with this armour, taking it apart. I've seen superb armours all in Japan, national treasures. This one, I have to say, absolutely tops the bill. It is the most superb piece of craftsmanship. I'll show you with detail in a moment. The sleeves, interestingly, have little containers on them for medicines and writing equipments. It would never have been worn in battle. I mean, it's an early period armour. It's for show, it's for showing your wealth, it's for showing your taste. And this shows you even more detail. This is the breastplate, the do, the cuirass. Absolutely, I can't stop using the word superb, because it is absolutely superb. The craftsmanship on this would have taken years to produce. The maple leaves are patinated copper alloy with gold inlay, and this is found all over the armour. And here you see the cross feathers, which are the mon, the family symbol of the Abe family. So this is an autumnal armour. I did say to the owner at that time, knowing how the Japanese like to do these things, I wonder if the spring armour will ever come up. And he looked, oh my goodness, there's a challenge for me. But this is now in the Crow Museum. As I say, one of the most superb armours I have ever seen. When attending the shogun's court in Edo, there were strict regulations as to what you could wear and what you could carry. Your clothes had to be sombre. Your swords had to be mounted in a sombre way as well. And we see here at the top of the image, these are all examples from the V&A collection. We see at the top here the daisho, the large and the small sword. The samurai had the prerogative of carrying the two swords. And the scabbards had to be of dark lacquer, which of course we can see here. The fittings, I won't go into my sword lecture, but briefly, the Japanese sword, the blade is the most important part of the sword, obviously, and it can be remounted for different occasions. So in parade, you could perhaps have a slightly flashier sword, but attending the shogun's sword, it had to be remounted. And it had to be remounted using sword fittings produced by the Goto school, who were the family craftsmen of the Tokugawa shogunate, who had a direct line of patronage to the shoguns. Anyone attending the shogun's court had to have fittings made by the Goto school, and we see the Goto school sword fittings here. This is the sword guard. It's a copper alloy known as shakudo, which is patinated to a rich black colour. The daimyo and regent of Japan, Hideyoshi, once referred to the colour of shakudo as rain on a crow's wing. So a very poetic way of describing it. And it's inlaid, the surface pattern is decorated with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of tiny little dots known as nanako, fish roe. And then there are raised decorations which are applied to the fittings as well. If you come to the Japan Gallery at the Victoria and Albert Museum, there's a video we had made where a craftsman by the name of Ford Hallam reproduced one of these fittings for us, and we spent 3 days filming with him. And he said he's never been so concentrated in his life at producing these patterns. Each dot is hit 3 times. And there are thousands of dots on there. And he did a calculation, I can't remember the figure, of how many times he hit that tsuba to produce those dots. And it's an absolutely regular pattern. I'm sorry the detail's not quite as good as it could be. That's the sword guard there, which of course goes there. This is called the kashira, and that's called the fuchi, and that is the pommel that goes at the end of the sword, and that is the collar that goes just before the sword guard there. But there are other fittings all over the sword as well. The late 16th century daimyo Oda Nobunaga was a great patron of the arts, and his castle at Azuchi, overlooking Lake Biwa, was decorated by famous painters of the Kano school. We can get an idea of castles of this and subsequent periods from the description of Azuchi Castle by Louis Frois, excuse my pronunciation, the Portuguese Jesuit missionary and chronicler of Japan, who wrote, quote, "Nobunaga's castle, which as regards architecture, strength, wealth and grandeur may well be compared with the greatest buildings of Europe. Inside, the walls are decorated with designs richly painted in gold and different colours, while the outside of each story is painted in various colours. In a word, the whole edifice is beautiful, excellent, and brilliant." The castle, however, was destroyed in 1582, soon after Nobunaga's assassination. We see here the imperial messenger's chamber in Nijo Castle to get some kind of idea of what the interior of these castles might have looked like. Fabulous painted sliding doors, wonderful metal fittings for the hand grip here, and these transoms beautifully decorated with gold and lacquer and painted ceilings. Superb buildings. Sorry, I've used that word again. I need to get a thesaurus out, I think. In 1617, Kano Tanyu was appointed official painter to the Tokugawa shogunate, and he and others of the Kano school worked on many important decorative commissions, notably Edo Castle, Nijo Castle, as we see here, and the shrine to Tokugawa Ieyasu at Nikko. We see here a detail of folding screens of birds and flowers of the four seasons by Kano's Sanraku, a 17th century piece, beautiful gold background and superb chickens, chrysanthemums, absolutely wonderful work of art. Other schools were involved as well. The Rinpa school of painting was started around 1600 by Tawarayama Sotatsu in Kyoto, and their work is characterized by the lavish use of rich colors with additions of gold and silver. One of these painters, Sakai Hoitsu, was in fact the son of the daimyo of Himeji Castle, so a high-ranking samurai in his own right. Of course, many samurai during the peaceful Edo period had to find other uses for their skills. They ruled, they were warriors. The samurai were the warriors class. Please never use the tautology samurai warrior, because by definition all samurai are warriors. But they had to find other uses for their time. And Sakai Hoitsu took to painting. He had a close relationship with the Tokugawa shoguns, trained in the Kano style, but is credited with the revival of the Rinpa style in the late 18th century. And we see here the famous painting, Flowers and Grasses of Spring and Summer. These screens were originally painted on the back of Ogata Korin's famous painting, Gods of Wind and Thunder, which we see here. And the discovery of a preparatory sketch for Hoitsu's screen carries the inscription, donated according to the request of Lord Hitotsubashi of the first rank, a preparatory painting for a pair of twofold screens with silver ground, from the brush of Korin on the obverse Thunder God, Wind God, on the reverse Summer Grasses in Rain, Autumn Grasses in Wind, completed and submitted on the 9th day, 11th month of the 4th year of Bunsei, that's 1821. So superb documentation of these two wonderful paintings. The wind and thunder gods on the bottom here, and these rather beautiful, elegant grasses on the panels here, and the river flowing in the background there. These are silver on the background. This is gold on the background here. Oh, and Lord Hitotsubashi was the father of Tokugawa Ienari, the 11th Tokugawa shogun. So again, direct connections between the daimyo and the shogunate. Other courtly pursuits taken up by the samurai included the shell game, the shell matching game. This was a courtly pursuit with its origins in the imperial court of the Heian period, but by the Edo period, it had been modified into a game of matching shells painted with images of famous poets, you see here, to the appropriate poem painted on another shell. So you had to show that you understood the subtlety behind both poetry and who had produced poetry at that time. This, together with the equally aristocratic pursuit of the incense game, or the way of incense, kodo, was also popular among the higher echelons of the military aristocrats. And the incense game is an interesting one. It shows not only your taste and your sensibilities in recognizing the subtleties of the various woods that are being burned. And in fact, the incense was also burned, but also sometimes the exotic wood was just heated to release the essential oils. This use of expensive materials, which could only be used once, was also an indication of your wealth and taste. If you burn a piece of wood, you can never use it again. There's a Japanese phrase, ichigo ichie, one time, one place, one occasion. Things only ever happen once. Make the most of that occasion. So the burning of the incense is a once-in-a-moment experience. You will never relive that experience. The expression was coined by an early 19th century tea master who lived in constant fear of assassination, as many high-ranking people did in Japan. And he made sure that every tea he made would taste as good because it would be his last cup of tea, potentially. Many of the rituals of the shogun's court were modelled on the imperial court, as I said. And clothes, not least, were an indication of rank. And all were expected to know their hierarchy within the court. This image here from a painted album shows formal wear for a daimyo or a high commissioner. And this is at the shogun's court, not the imperial court. But the clothes are exactly the same. You have a court hat, court robes, He's not wearing the formal court shoes, but he has got this incredibly long trail behind him here. And sometimes they wear those strange trousers that actually go under the feet, so you have to shuffle along very, very carefully, wearing away your clothes as you do. But he carries a sword. This is called a kazaridachi. This is one that we have in the Victoria and Albert Museum collection. These date back to the Heian period, 10th, 11th century. The one that we have here is made in the 17th century, and in fact, it holds a blade inscribed, "Made by Echu no Kami Fujiwara no Masatoshi to the order of Lord Nobumitsu of Shōni rank," and dated equivalent to 1682. So it's a properly made sword with an inscription that dates it precisely. And it would do you a bit of damage, but only if you hit somebody with it, because it's blunt. You wouldn't necessarily want a courtier to carry a sharp sword at court, and very often these swords were purely decorative, and the blades, although made properly, were not that effective as a blade in itself. The original Heian period swords would be gold and lapis lazuli. The one here is gilded copper with enamels here. Nonetheless, a beautiful thing in its own right, made by top quality craftsmen, again employed by the shogunate or by commission to the daimyo, but wonderful filigree work on the fitting here, inlaid with mother of pearl, gold maquillé sprinkled lacquer on here, and the finest, I don't know whether you can see here, the finest rayskin on the hilt. The other thing to note, from a purely practical point of view, having practiced fencing it before, it's not something you'd want to use. That hilt there has raised decoration, very similar to these pieces here. If you hold it in your hand for more than a few seconds, by goodness, it really hurts. Those decorations really dig into your hand. So again, it looks like a good weapon. It's decorative, and that's all. Even within the generally restrained tea ceremony, you find scope for luxury. This is a gold brazier and tea kettle created for Tokugawa Ieyasu. They weigh respectively 3.15 and 7.013 kilograms. And according to Tokugawa records, they were used on very special occasion, quote, for persons of high rank. And they may actually hark back to the golden tea room created around 1586 by the regent Toyotomi Hideyoshi. In addition to the appreciation of Chinese porcelain, the ruling samurai class also developed a love of finely decorated domestic ceramics. And one daimyo, the regional warlord, who retained a complete monopoly over the particular form of domestic porcelain, was that of the daimyo of Nabeshima, an area just north of Arita. Production here was carefully supervised and technical secrets were carefully guarded. Defective pieces were destroyed. Nabeshima porcelain was reserved for private use and as gifts to high-ranking officials and were consequently very much in demand. These three here are from the BM's collection and date to around 1700 or so. By the 19th century, this form of ceramics did become more readily available. Apart from fine arms and armour, which were greatly treasured by the ruling samurai and which required a great deal of time and craftsmanship to produce, it's perhaps lacquer, which was the most time-consuming and costly luxury craft made for the upper echelons of the samurai class, and I stress the upper echelons of the samurai class. We see here a bridal trousseau for the daimyo of Nambu clan. The intricate objects are decorated with maquillé sprinkled picture lacquer on a nashiji, a pear-skin ground, with fittings of silver, and each piece carries the crest of the family. I must say, with my own daughter's upcoming wedding, I'm thankful she hasn't demanded anything remotely like this for her trousseau. Skillful and creative writing in the form of poetry and calligraphy was essential for the cultured samurai. This writing table, with classical undertones, depicts a tranquil rural setting and a viewing pavilion and the Shinto shrine, and it reflects the Japanese aesthetic of wabi, sometimes referred to as cultured poverty. Increasingly through the Edo period, taste and patronage were changing, and soon the types of objects which were previously being made exclusively for the samurai were also being made for rich merchants to whom the samurai were becoming indebted. And it becomes increasingly difficult at times to establish for whom particular objects are being made. Two examples of objects here from the V&A collection. On the left, a lacquered box with rimpa-style decoration of stylized waves, and on the right, a lacquered cosmetic box with a design of willows. Very simple, very elegant. Likewise, this is very simple and very elegant. But back to armour, the most important thing for the samurai. The Myochin family had a long tradition of producing armour for Japan's ruling military class. And this, in the V&A's collection, is a fine example of a late Edo period copy of an armour of the Kamakura period, 12th to 14th century, but with embellishments that would not normally be found on earlier armours. It represents the type of ceremonial armour that was produced under the nationalistic revival of the early 19th century. A type of armour that might have been made for Sankin Kotai, these processions backwards and forwards between Edo and the provinces, or simply for display in the family home in the tokonoma, where seasonal paintings were displayed or other forms of objects. Again, it's a very fine suit of armour. The pieces that would not normally be, if you're interested, on a Kamakura period armour are these leg guards down here. Otherwise, it's fairly accurate. It weighs a ton, and it is referred to in the V&A as Queen Victoria's armour. Not because it's small and squat, which it is, but because it was part of the diplomatic gift from the last but one shogun, Tokugawa Iemochi, to Queen Victoria in 1860, which she in turn presented to the V&A. The helmet is signed by the Myochin family, who trace their lineage back to the 13th century, but probably not really until the 16th century. And it's signed Myochin Mondo Kino Muniharu on a day in the 8th month of the 6th year of Ansei, 1859. And so we think the armour was specifically assembled to be part of the diplomatic gift from Iemochi to Queen Victoria, and which was handled by Sir Rutherford Alcock, one of our first accredited diplomats in Japan. He wasn't an ambassador. That didn't happen until the early 1900s. And swords. The tang of this superb, I've written it down, I'll quote it again, blade is inlaid in gold with the name Tomomitsu and the date Kenmu Ninen, 1335. Japanese swords, the blade being the most important part, can be passed down from generation to generation and are well cared for. I've handled swords that date back to the 9th century, which are absolutely wonderful objects in their own right, but they were remounted at different times. This sword was given by the Emperor Meiji, following his restoration in 1868, to Sir Harry Parkes, the first fully accredited minister. Alcott wasn't fully accredited, I apologise. On the occasion of Parkes' private visit and audience with the Emperor in May 1871. And Parkes subsequently gave the sword to the Victoria and Albert Museum. It's mounted in a fine gold lacquered scabbard, decorated with high relief hiramakie blossoms of cherry on a sprinkled makie background. All of the metal fittings are of solid gold, including the chain. Even the rayskin hilt under here is lacquered in gold as well. And a plate underneath the sword guard has a long dedicatory inscription dated to the 2nd month of 1871, suggesting that all the fittings, as well as the mounting, were made especially for the presentation of the sword to parks. But I'm going to end on a lighter note of diplomatic gifts. This is a sake flask. The label reads, produced by the Imaharo Brewery, Iyo Province, saffron sake. Edo retail outlet, and it gives a full address of where the sake was produced. This was again part of the diplomatic gift from Tokugawa Iemochi to Queen Victoria. There were 4 such sake flasks. 3 of them are empty, and one wonders whether they were actually consumed by Her Majesty at some point. This one, however, is full. And the late Professor Oliver Impey from the Ashmolean Museum, bless him, said, before I go, I'm going to have some of this. Without any warning, he broke the seal on it and sampled it. And he said, by God, that's awful, but bloody hell, it smells good. And it does, it smells of honey. And I tried to get sake producers in Japan. I had permission from the museum to give samples to see whether sake producers wanted to try to replicate this sake, but no one was interested. If you know any sake producers, do let me know. We'll see if we reproduce it. Because I wonder how many, where are we now, 1860? I wonder how many 160-year-old bottles of sake are in existence today. We've resealed it hermetically, so it won't evaporate anymore, and no one is now going to be allowed to break the seal and try it again. But I think that's a wonderful example of something in a diplomatic gift, something to be used. So, in 1853, the arrival of the American fleet in Edo was a catalyst for the end of samurai rule and of patronage. But the traditional craftsmakers of Japan soon found new markets for their superb skills at the many international exhibitions held in the second half of the 19th century. That, in fact, was the lecture I was giving on Monday online to the V&A, so if you want to hear that one, I can do that one too. I hope that this rather fleeting overview of some 700 years of samurai rule and patronage has given some idea of how the art of war and the arts of peace can coexist. Thank you.